Chapter 4. One summer morning, the year after, Kristin was in the penthouse in front of the old hearth-room house, setting in order some gear in the chests that stood there. A noise came to her ears of horses being led out, and she went and looked out between the small pillars of the penthouse. One of the housecarls was leading out 2 horses, and Gout came forth from the stable doorway. The child Erland was sitting astride his father's shoulder. The bright little face looked out about the man's yellow hair, and Gout held the boy's little hand in his great brown one up under his chin. He handed the child to a maid who came across the yard and mounted his horse. But when Erland screamed and reached up after his father, Gout took him again and set him on the saddle bow in front of him. At that moment Jofrid came from the hall. "Are you taking Erland with you? Where are you going?" Gout made answer. He was bound for the mill. The river was likely to carry it away. "And Erland has a mind to go along with father," he says. "Are you out of your wits?" She caught the boy quickly to her arms, and Gout laughed aloud. "I verily believe you thought I meant to take him with me. You drag the poor thing about with you everywhere. I well believe you would do as the lynx does, eat the little one up before you let any other get him." She waved with one of the child's hands to Gout as he rode from the manor. Then she put the boy down on the grass, crouched over him for a moment, and talked to him a little, and then ran across to the new storehouse and up to the loft. Kristin stood still, watching her grandson. The morning sun shone so fair on the little red-clad child. Young Erland toddled around in rings, gazing down into the grass. Now he grew aware of a heap of chips, and straightway set to work, painfully heaving them about. Kristin laughed. He was 15 months old, but forward for his age, his parents thought, for he both walked and ran, and could say 2 or 3 words to boot. Now he steered his way straight for the little water gutter that ran across the bottom of the courtyard and swelled to a purling beck when rains had fallen in the fells. Kristin ran out and took him up in her arms. "Mustn't. Mother will be angry if you get wet." The boy pouted, pondering perhaps if he should cry because he was kept from paddling in the beck, or if he should give in. To get wet was the deadly sin for him. Jofrid was all too strict with him in such like things. But he looked so serious. Laughingly, Kristin kissed the boy, set him down, and went back to the penthouse. But her work went but slowly. For the most part she stood looking out on the courtyard. The morning sun shone so soft and fair on the 3 storehouses in front of her. It was as though Kristin had not seen them rightly for a long time past. How brave the houses were, with their loft balconies adorned with pillars and rich carving. The gilded vane on the gable cross of the new storehouse glittered against the blue haze that hung over the fell behind. This year, after the wet early summer, the grass on the roofs was so fresh and green. Kristin sighed a little, looked once more on little Erland, and turned to her chests again. All at once there came from outside a child's wailing cry. She flung down all she had in her hands and rushed out. Erland stood shrieking, looking from his finger to a half-dead wasp lying on the grass and back again. When his grandmother lifted him up with pitying words, he shrieked still louder, And when, with yet more sounds of pity and compassion, she bound wet earth in a cold green leaf upon the sting, his wailing grew fearful to hear. Lulling and caressing him, she bore him into her room, and he shrieked as though his last hour were come, and stopped short in the middle of a yell. He knew the box and the horn spoon which his grandmother took from the door lintel. Kristin dipped bits of soft bannock and honey and fed him with them, while she went on petting him, rubbing her cheek against his neck, where the fair hair was still short and crinkled from the days when he had lain still in his cradle and worn it away on the pillow. And Erland had forgotten his woes now. He turned his face up to the woman and offered to pat and kiss her with his sticky hands and mouth. In the middle of these doings, Jofrid stood in the door. "Have you brought him in? Surely it wasn't necessary, mother. I was only up in the loft." Kristin told of the mischance that had befallen Erland. "Did you not hear how he shrieked?" Jofrid thanked her mother-in-law. "But now we will not trouble you any longer." She took the child that now reached out to his mother and went her way. Kristin put away the honey box. Then she sat on, her hands in her lap. The chests in the penthouse might wait till Ingrid came in. It had been meant that she should have Frida Lavransdatter to wait on her when she moved over into the old hall. But then Frida was wedded off to one of the jackmen who had come over with Helge Duke, a lad that might have been her son. "'Tis the use in our part of the land that our underlings hearken to their masters when they counsel them for their good," said Jofrid, when Kristin marvelled that this match was come about. "And in this countryside," said Kristin, "the common folk are unused to obey us further than 'tis reason they should, or to hearken to our counsel, except it is for their good as fully as for ours. This is good counsel I give you, Jofrid, when I ask you to bear this in mind." "It is as mother says, Jofrid," said Gaut, but passing meekly. Even before he was wed with her, Kristin had seen that Gaut was most reluctant to cross Jofrid, and he was grown to be a most compliant husband. The mother-in-law did not deny that in many things Gaut might do well to listen to his wife. She was shrewd, notable, and hard-working far beyond the common. And she was so more wanton than Kristin herself had been. She too had trodden underfoot her duty as a daughter, and sold her honour, because she could not win the man she had set her heart on at a cheaper rate. But once she had won her will, she was the most faithful and modest of wives. Kristin knew that Jofrid loved her husband very much, that she was proud of his good looks and of his noble birth. Her sisters were richly wed, but their husbands were best seen at night, when no moon was shining, and of their forefathers the less said the better, Jofrid let fall scornfully. She was jealous of her husband's welfare and his honour as she understood them, and at home she spoiled him all she could. But if Gaut ventured to be of another mind than his wife in the least of trifles, Jofrid would first agree in such a fashion that Gaut faltered straight away, and then she would set to work and talk him round. But Gaut throve and was content. No one could doubt that the two young folks lived well together. Gaut was happy with his wife, and both were marvellous proud of their son, and loved him beyond all measure. So now everything might have been for the best. If only Jofrid Helgesdatter had not been, well, she was niggardly. Kristin could not call it anything else. Had she not been so, it would have vexed Kristin less that her son's wife was so set on her own will. The very first autumn, when she was but newly wedded and come to be the mistress, Kristin had seen at the harvest time that the work folk were ill content, though they scarce said a word. but the old mistress noticed it nonetheless. It might have happened in Kristin's time too that the folk had to eat herring that had gone musty, bacon as yellow and high-smelling as fir-root splints, and tainted meat. But then all had known that the mistress would surely make up for it with some extra good titbit at another time, milk porridge or fresh cheese, and good ale out of season. And when food came round that got a bad taste and must be eaten up, all knew it was but the overflow, as it were, of Kristin's bursting storehouses. And when folk were in sore need, then the abundance of the Jorengard storehouses was a blessing to the whole parish. Already folk felt less sure that Jofrid would prove open-handed in dealing out help in food, when the common folk felt the pinch of dearth. This it was that vexed the mother-in-law, for it seemed to diminish the honour of the manor and of its master. That even in this 1 year she herself had been made to feel that her daughter-in-law favoured her own part unduly was a thing that touched her less nearly. It had shown already in Bartholomew's Mass, when she had been given 2 of the slaughtered goats instead of the 4 she should have had. True, the glutton had made havoc among the small stock in the fells that summer, but still Kristin thought it shameful to take account of 2 goats on so great a manor. But she held her peace. And it was the same with all her dues from the manor: autumn slaughtering, corn and flour, fodder for her 4 cows and 2 saddle horses. She was always given short measure or poor wares. She noticed that Gout disliked this and was ashamed, but he dared do nothing for fear of his wife, and so he acted as though he didn't see it. Gout was as open-handed as were all Erland Nicolaussen's sons. In his brothers the mother had called it wastefulness, but Gout was a worker and content with little for himself. If he only had the best of horses and hounds and some good hawks, he did not care for the rest to live in any other way than the small farmers of the dale. But if folk came to the manor, he was a free-handed host to guests of every kind, and bountiful to beggars, and therein he was a housemaster after his mother's heart. It was thus, she thought, great folk should live, who dwelt upon their Udal lands in their own countryside, making their goods yield increased, wasting nothing uselessly, but neither sparing anything when love of God and of his poor, or care for the honour of the house required that they should give from their store. She saw now that Jofrid, like most, Gout's rich friends and kinsmen of worship. Nevertheless, in this matter, Gout seemed least willing to be guided by his wife. He tried to hold fast to the old comrades of his youth, brother tipplers, Jofrid called them. And indeed Kristin learnt now that Gout had been somewhat wilder than she knew of. But those friends did not come uninvited to his manor after he became a wedded man. And so far it was sure no poor man had been sent away empty by Gout. But he gave much smaller gifts when Jofrid was looking on. Behind her back he would give more, as it were, by stealth, but it was not much that could happen behind Jofrid's back. And Kristin saw that Jofrid was jealous of her. His mother had had Gout's friendship and trust so wholly and fully all these years, since he was her poor sick child that was able neither to live nor die. Now she noticed that Jofrid did not like it if Gout sat down by his mother, asked her counsel, or got her to tell stories as in the old days. If the man forgot the time and lingered a little by her down in the old hall, it would not be long before Jofrid found an errand thither. And she would grow jealous if her mother-in-law made too much of little Erland. Out in the yard there grew in the short trodden grass certain herbs with coarse, dark, leathery leaves. But now, in the sunny days of midsummer, there sprang a little stalk with clear, pale blue flowerets up from the middle of each flattened wall. To Kristin it seemed that the old outer leaves, scarred as they were by every foot of man or beast that had trampled them, must love the sweet, bright, flowering heart-shoot, even as she loved her son's son. He seemed to her to be life of her life, and flesh of her flesh, as surely as her own children, but yet more sweetly. When she had a chance to hold him in her lap, and saw that the boy's mother watched the two jealously the while, took him away as soon as for shame's sake she might, laid him, secure in her own ownership, to her breast, and pressed him to her greedily, then it dawned on Kristin Lavransdatter as never before that the preachers of God's word were right. The life of the body was tainted with unrest beyond all cure. In the world where men mixed, begot new generations, were driven together by fleshly love, and loved their own flesh, there came heartache and broken hopes, as surely as rime comes in autumn. Both life and death sundered friends at last, as surely as winter parts the tree from its leaves. Now it befell one evening, 14 days before Olaf's Mass, that a band of mumpers came to Jorengard and prayed the loan of a house for the night. Kristin was standing on the balcony of the old storehouse. It was to be at her disposal now. She heard Jofrid come out and answer the beggars. Food they could have, but she could not give them shelter. "We ourselves are many, and we have our mother-in-law living on the manor. She has half of the houses." Wrath flamed up in the one-time lady of the manor. Never had it happened before that wayfarers had been denied a night's shelter at Jorengard. And the sun was already touching the western ridges. She ran down and went across to Jofrid and the beggars. "They can have lodging in my house, Jofrid, and being there it would be well. I should give them their meat too. Never before on this manor have we denied a fellow Christian shelter when he asked it in God's name." "Do as you think fit, mother," answered Jofrid, fiery red in the face. When Kristin had looked more nearly at the beggars, she well nigh repented her offer. It was not quite without reason that the young wife was reluctant to have these folk on the manor overnight. Gout and the housefolk were away on the far meadows up by the Sill water, and would not be home at evening. Jofrid was alone at home with the parish beadsfolk, an old couple and 2 children, and Kristin and her servant in the old hall. And many and strange as were the kinds of folk Kristin was used to see in wandering bands of beggars, she liked the looks of these but ill. 4 were big and strong young men, 3 of them red-haired with small wild eyes. These seemed to be brothers, but the 4th, who had had both his nostrils slit and had no ears, spoke a broken tongue as though he were an outlander. Besides these there were 2 old folks. A little crooked fellow, yellowish-green in face, hair and beard from dirt and age, with belly swollen as from some ailment. He went on crutches. And an old woman, her neck and hands covered with sores, and her headcloth reeking with blood and matter. Kristin shuddered at the thought that this creature might have come near to Erland. But nonetheless, it was well for these wretched old folk that the band should not need to wander about the Hammer Fells that night. And the beggars behaved them peaceably enough. Once the earless one tried to catch a hold of Ingrid as she was setting food on the board, but Bjorn straightway bristled up and growled. For the rest, they seemed out of heart and weary. They had suffered much ill and got but little gain, they answered to the mistress's questioning. It would be better at Nidaros, perhaps. The woman was pleased when Kristin gave her a goat's horn full of good grease, made of purest lamb's fat and little children's water. But she would not have it when Kristin offered to steep her head clout in warm water and give her a clean linen cloth. The cloth, indeed, she took. All the same, Kristin had Ingrid, the young serving-maid, sleep innermost in her bed. Once or twice during the night Bjorn growled, but else all was still. A little after midnight the dog ran to the door and gave a couple of short barks. Kristin heard hoofbeats in the courtyard and knew that it was Gout coming home. She guessed that Jofrid had sent word to him. Kristin filled the beggars' wallets well the next morning, and they were gone but a little way beyond the manor gate when she saw Jofrid and Gout making for her house. Kristin sat down and took up her spindle. She greeted her children fairly when they came in and asked Gout about the hay. Jofrid sniffed. The guests had left a fusty smell behind them. But her mother-in-law made as if she noticed nothing. Gout shifted about uneasily and seemed to find it hard to bring out his errand. On that, Jofrid took the word from him. "There is one matter, mother, that I think it were best we spoke of now. I see well you think I am more saving than you think befits the mistress of Jorungard. I know that you think this, and you think also that I diminish Gout's honour thereby. Now, I will not say anything of how I was afraid last night to take in this band, seeing that I was alone on the manor with my baby child and a few old parish folk, for I saw you understood it as soon as you had come to get sight of your guests. But I have noticed before, too, that you think I am a niggard with food and ungentle to the poor. I am not so, mother. But Jorungard is no longer the seat of a king's man and a rich man, as it was in your father's and mother's time. You were a rich man's child. You went about amongst rich and mighty kinsfolk. You were wedded richly, and your husband lifted you up to yet greater power and station than you were brought up to. No one can expect that you should fully understand in your old age how far different it is with Gout, who has lost his father's heritage, and who must share the half of your father's riches with many brothers. And I dare not forget that I brought little more to his estate than the child I bore beneath my heart, and a heavy burden of amends for my love to pay, seeing that I was party to the wrong he wrought my kin. Now, time may make that good, but it is my duty to pray God to grant my father long life. We are young folk, Gout and I. We don't know how many children will be our lot to have. You must believe, mother-in-law, I have no other thought in all I do but for the good of my husband and our children." "I believe it, Jofrid." Kristin looked gravely into her daughter-in-law's flushed face. "And never have I meddled with your householding, nor denied that you are a notable woman and a good and faithful wife to my son. But you must let me deal with my own as I am used to do. As you say, I am an old woman, and no longer apt to learn new ways." The young folk understood that the mother had nothing more to say to them, and soon after they took their leave. As ever, Kristin felt she must admit that Jofrid was right, at first. But when she thought about it, it seemed to her, no, she was not right, after all. It was against reason to liken Gout's alms with her father's. Gifts for the soul's peace of the poor and strangers dying in the parish, dowry gifts to fatherless maids, ale feasts on the holy days of her father's best-loved saints, doles to sick folk and sinners journeying to seek St. Olaf. Even had Gout been much richer than he was, no one had looked that he should put himself to such costs. Gout thought no more of his Maker than he needs must. He was free-handed and good-hearted, but Kristin had seen that her father held the poor he helped in reverence, because Jesus had chosen a poor man's lot when he came in the flesh. And her father had loved hard work, and thought that all handicraft was honoured, since that God's mother, Mary, chose to be a working woman who spun to win bread for herself and hers, though she was a daughter of rich folk, and came of the kindred of the kings and high priests of the Jewish land. 2 days after, early in the morning, While Jofrid was still going about half-clad and Gout lay in bed, Kristin came into them. She had on a kirtle and cloak of grey wadmal, bore a wide-brimmed black felt hat above her coif, and strong shoes upon her feet. Gout flushed deeply when he saw his mother dressed this way. Kristin said she was minded to go afoot to Nidaros to St. Olaf's feast, and she asked her son to see to her affairs while she was gone. Gout strove eagerly to shake her purpose. He would have had her at least borrow horses and groom from him, and take her serving-maid with her. But, as was most like coming from a man lying in his naked bed before his mother's eyes, his words carried little weight. So abashed was he that in pity Kristin thought to say that she had had a dream. "I have thought long, too, till I see your brothers again." But at that she had to turn away. She had not yet dared confess to herself how she yearned and feared to meet her 2 eldest sons again. Gout was set on bearing his mother company for the first part of her way. While he dressed himself and had a bite of food, Kristin sat laughing and playing with little Erland. He crowed and chirped, new-wakened and in a twitter with morning life. She kissed Jofrid at parting, and this she had never done before. In the courtyard all the household was gathered. Ingrid had spread the tidings that Mistress Kristin was going on pilgrimage to Nidaros. Kristin took the heavy iron-shod staff in her hand, and as she would not ride, Gout laid her double wallets across his horse and drove it on before him. Up on the church green, Kristin turned about and looked down upon her manor. So fair it lay in the dewy, sun-bright morning. The river shone white. The housefolk stood there yet. She could make out Jofrid's light dress and coif, and the child, a patch of red upon her arm. Gout saw his mother's face grow pale with the fullness of her heart. The road bore upwards through the woods under the shadow of Hammer Fell. Kristin walked as lightly as a young maid. She and her son did not speak much together, and when they had walked for 2 hours, they came where the way bears off over Rostkampen, and the whole Dover countryside lies spread before one northward. Then Kristin said Gout must go no further with her, but she would sit a while and rest before going on. Down beneath them lay the dale, with the river's greenish-white ribbon wandering through it, and the farms like small green patches on the forest-covered slopes. But higher up the upland mosses arched, brownish or yellow with lichen, inward towards the grey screes and the bare heights flecked with snowdrifts. Cloud shadows drifted over the dale and the uplands, but northward all was clear among the fells. The heaped-up hills had flung off their cloaks of mist and shone blue one behind the other. And Kristin's yearning moved with the cloud flocks northward on the long road that lay before her, hurried over the dale in among the great mountains that blocked the way, and along the steep tracks across the uplands. A few days more and she would be wending her way downward through Trondheim's rich green dales, following the river's windings towards the great fjord. She shuddered at the memory of the well-known places by the sea, where she and youth had gone about together. Erland's fair form moved before her sight, with changing looks and bearing, swift, unclear, as though she saw him mirrored in running water. Last of all she would come forth on Fegensbrekke by the marble cross, and there would lie the town by the river mouth, between the blue fjord and the green ridge of Strind, and on the river bank the mighty shining church with dizzy towers and golden vanes, the evening sunlight burning on the rose midway on its breast. And far up the fjord, under Frosta's blue hills, lay Tautra, low and black like a whale's back, the church standing up like the steering fin. "Oh, my Björgulf! Oh, Nakvi!" But when she looked back over her shoulder, She could still see a little of the home fell below Hoveringen. It lay in shadow, but her well-used eye could see where the Sæter path went through the woods. She knew the grey mountain tops that rose above the cloak of forest. They ringed about the sill-dwellers' old Sæter fields. From the hills above came stray notes of a cow horn, a few clear, high tones that died away and came again. It sounded like children practising them in blowing. Far-off tinkling of bells, and the muffled roar of the river and the deep sighs of the forest in the still warm day. Kristin's heart trembled with unrest in the stillness. She was drawn as with homesickness onward, as with homesickness backward, to the parish and the manor. Visions swarmed before her sight, pictures of daily life. She saw herself running with the goats on the path through the sparse woods south of their Sæter. A cow had got mired in the bog. The sun shone brightly. When she stood a moment and listened, she felt her own sweat bite into her skin. She saw the courtyard at home in a flurry of snow, a grey day of storm darkening into a wild winter night. She was all but blown back into the outer room when she opened the door. The storm took her breath away. But there they loomed up, two shapeless bundles of men in snow-smothered fur coats. Ivar and Skule had come home. Their skis sank deep into the big drift that ever heaped itself together right across the yard when it was blowing from the northwest. On such days there were always deep drifts in two places in the courtyard, and all at once it was as though she must think with love and longing of those two snowdrifts that she and all folk on the manor had cursed every winter. It was as if she were doomed never to see them again. It seemed as if these yearnings burst her heart in sunder. They ran hither and thither like streams of blood, seeking out ways to all places in the wide-stretched land where she had lived, to all the sons she had wandering in the world, to all her dead beneath the moulds. She wondered, could it be that she was fey? She had never felt the like of this before. Then she saw that Gaut was sitting staring at her, and she smiled quickly, as if in excuse. It was time they should say farewell, and she go on her way. Gaut called to his horse that had wandered forward grazing along the green track. He ran after it and brought it back, and they said farewell. Kristin had her wallets over her shoulder already, and her son had set his foot in the stirrup. Then he turned and took a step forward. "Mother!" For a moment she looked deeply into his beshamed, helpless eyes. "You have not been well content this last year, I think, mother. Jofrid means well. She holds you in great reverence, but perhaps even so I should have said more to her of what manner of woman you are and always were. How come you to have such thoughts, my Gaut?" His mother spoke gently and wonderingly. "I know well myself that I am no longer young, and old folk, they say, are hard to please. But I am not so old that I have not the wit to know your worth, yours and your wife's. An ill thing would I count it were Jofrid to think that it had all been vain and thankless toil, all she has done to spare me from work and care. Don't think that of me, I pray you, my son, that I didn't appreciate your wife's worth and your faithful duty as love. If I have not shown it as much as you might expect, you must bear with me, remembering that is the way of old folk." Gaut stared at his mother, open-mouthed. "Mother!" Then he burst into tears and leaned against his horse, shaking with sobs. But Kristin kept a firm hold on herself. Her voice betrayed nothing but wonder and motherly kindness. "My Gaut, you are young in years, and true it is that you were my pet lamb, as your father was wont to say. But none the less "You must not take this parting thus, my son. Now you are a grown man, and the master of a house. If I were bound for Rome or Jerusalem, then indeed, but on this journey I shall scarce meet with such great perils. I shall find folk to bear me company, you know, for sure when I come to Toftar, if not before. For each morning at this season pilgrim troops set out from there." "Mother, mother, forgive us. So we took all power and all rule out of your hands, thrusting you aside." Kristin shook her head with a little smile. "I am afraid that you children must think me a woman over-fond to rule." Gout turned to her. She took his hand in one of hers and laid her other hand on his shoulder, while she begged him once more to believe she was not unthankful to him or Jofrid, and prayed that God be with him. Then she turned him around towards his horse, and laughingly smote him between the shoulders for good luck. She stood looking after him till he sank from sight below the brow of the hill, so handsome as he was on the big dark grey horse. She felt her mood a strange one. Everything around her came so sharply to her sense. The sun-steeped air, the warm breath of the pine-wood, the twitter of tiny birds in the grass. Yet at the same time, looking within herself, she saw pictures like the visions that high fever brings. Within her was an empty house, wholly soundless, dark, and breathing desolation. The vision changed. A strand at ebb, the tide far withdrawn from it, pale worn stones, heaps of dark, lifeless tangle, all kinds of driftage. Then she settled her bag more easily on her shoulder, grasped her staff, and set forth on her way down into the dale. If it were fated that she should not come this way any more, then it was God's will. Useless to be afraid. And most like it was but that she was growing old. She crossed herself and went her way with firmer step, willing all the same to get down to the hill slopes where the road ran among the farms. Only from one short stretch on the highway could one see the houses at Haugen, high on the topmost mountain ridge. Her heart set to throbbing at the thought. As she had thought, she met with many pilgrims when she came to Toftar late in the day. Next morning they made a little troop as they set off up the fells in company. A priest with his servant and 2 women, his mother and sister, were on horseback, and soon were far ahead of those on foot. Kristin felt a pang in her heart as she looked after the second woman who rode between her 2 children. In Kristin's company there were 2 oldish yeomen from a little farm here on Dovre. Then there were 2 younger men from Oslo, craftsmen of the city, and a farmer with his daughter and her husband. Quite young people, these 2. They were journeying with the young folk's child, a little maid, a year and a half old maybe, and had a horse they rode by turns. These 3 were from a parish far south in the land, and Abu by name. Kristin did not know where it was. That first evening Kristin begged to look at the child, for it cried and whimpered without cease. It looked wretchedly, with a great hairless head and small slack-jointed body. It could neither speak nor sit upright yet. The mother seemed ashamed of it, and when next morning Kristin proffered to bear her daughter a while for her, she was left with it on her hands. The mother pushed on far in front. She seemed to be a cuckoo mother. But they were over young, both she and her husband, scarce 18 years old, and she might well be weary of bearing a heavy child that was ever puling and weeping. The grandfather was an ugly, sulky, cross-grained man, but it was he who had been set on journeying to Nidaros with his daughter's daughter, so he seemed to have some kindness for her. Kristin walked beside him and the 2 Franciscan monks at the tail of the troop. and it vexed her soul that the man from Anderbu never thought to lend the monks his horse for a while. All could see that the younger monk was grievously sick. The elder, Brother Arngrim, was a round little man, with a round, red, freckled face, lively brown eyes, and a foxy red ring of hair about his pate. He talked endlessly, mostly of the poverty they lived in, the barefoot monks of Skidaan. The order had but newly got a house in that town, but they were so parlous poor they were scarce able to keep going the services, and the church they had been minded to build would never come to anything for sure. He laid the blame on the rich nuns of Gimsoy, who pursued the poor begging friars with envy and spite, and now had a suit at law against them. With glib-tongued relish he told all kinds of evil tales about them. Kristin didn't like to hear the monk talk in this fashion, and his tales of how it was said their abbess had been chosen uncanonically, and how the nuns missed the offices in slothful slumber and were given to tattling and to unchaste talk over the board in the refectory, seemed to her little to be trusted. Indeed, of one sister he had said outright that folk thought she had not kept her vows of chastity. But she saw that Brother Arngrim was otherwise a good-hearted and a kindly man. He bore the sick child long stretches when he saw that Kristin's arms were weary, and when it screamed too grievously, he would set off at a run over the upland, with his gown kilted high, so that the juniper flogged his black, hairy legs, and the mire splashed up from the bog-holes, while he shouted and bawled to the mother that now she must wait for them, because the child was thirsty. Then he trotted back to the sick man, Brother Torgils. To him he was the tenderest and most loving of fathers. With the sick monk it was impossible to come to Jødkin that night. But the two Dovre men knew of a stone hut by a tarn a little southward in the waste, and the pilgrims made towards it. The evening was grown cold by now. The ground by the edge of the water was swampy, and white mist rose from the marsh, so that the birch trees dripped with wet. A thin sliver of moon hung over the mountain tops in the west, its pale yellow scarce showing in the yellow evening sky. More and more often Brother Torgils was forced to stand still. He coughed so sorely it was pitiful to hear. Brother Arngrim held him up in these bouts, and after wiped his face and mouth. Then with a shake of the head showed Kristin his hand. It was bloody with the sick man's spittle. They found the hut, but it had fallen into ruin. So they sought out a sheltered spot and made a bonfire. But the poor folk from the south had not thought that night in the fells would be so icy cold. Kristin took from her sack the cloak that gout had forced upon her, because it was so passing light and warm, of fine boughten cloth lined with beaver fur. When she wrapped Brother Torgils in it, he whispered, he was so hoarse he could scarcely speak, that he would like to have the child lie in it with him. So they put the child in with him. It whimpered and wailed, and the monk coughed. But between whiles both of them got some sleep. Part of the night Kristin kept watch with one of the Dovre men and Brother Arngrim, tending to the fire. The pale yellow light drew round to the northern sky. The tarn lay at their side, white and still. Fish rose and made rings upon the water, but under the hill on the farther side the water mirrored black darkness. Once an uncanny barking screech came to their ears from over there. The monk started and gripped the other two hard by the arms. Kristin and the farmer thought it was some beast. Then they heard a stone roll, as if someone was walking on the hillside screes, and another cry like a gruff voice of a man. The monk began to pray aloud. She caught the words, "Jesus Christ, the Saviour, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, has conquered. Jesus Christus Soter," and "Vincit Leo de Truba Judah." Then they heard a door shut to, away under the mountain. The faint grey dawn began to show. The scree across the lake and the clumps of birch came into sight. Then the other Dovre man and the man from Oslo relieved them at the fire. The last thing Kristin thought before she fell asleep, close into the fire, was that, should they make such short marches and give an alms to the beggar monks she must when they parted, it was like she would have to beg her meat at the farms when they came down into Galdal. The sun was well up already, and the morning wind was darkening the lake in little squalls, when the frozen pilgrims gathered about Brother Arngrim while he said the morning prayers. Brother Torgil sat crouched together, with chattering teeth, striving to keep back his cough as he mumbled the words over after him. When she looked at the monks' ashen-grey gowns, with the sun shining on them, Kristin remembered that she had dreamed of Brother Edvin. She could not remember the details of her dream, but she kneeled and kissed the monks' hands and prayed for their blessing on the company. The sight of the beaver skin cloak had shown the other pilgrims that Kristin was not come of small folk, and when she chanced to say that she had journeyed twice before by the King's Highway over the Dovrefjell, she became a sort of guide and leader to the band. The Dovre men had never been farther north than to Jødkin, and the folk from Viken were, of course, quite strange here. They came to Jødkin before the hour of Vespers, and after the service in the chapel, Kristin went out into the hills alone. She wanted to find again the path she had followed with her father, and the spot by the beck where she had sat down with him. These she could not find, but she thought she had found the hillock she had clambered up, that she might gaze after him as he rode away from her. So she thought, but the little stony ridges along the pathway here were much alike. She knelt amid the bearberry vines at the top of the knoll. The summer evening was growing dusk. The birch tree slopes on the hillsides, the grey screes and the brown stretches of marshland melted together. But above the wide-stretched mountain waste, the evening sky arched its clear, fathomless bowl. All the pools shone whitely, and the heavenly brightness was given back, broken and more faint, from the little mountain beck that hurried, chafing restlessly over stones, to flow out between pale gravel banks into a little moorland tarn. Again there came upon her that strange, feverish inner vision. The stream seemed to show her a picture of her own being. Thus had she hurried restlessly through the waste of these earthly years, foamed up in turbulent chafing at every stone in her path. It was but weakly and fitfully and palely that the everlasting light could mirror itself in her life. But it dawned upon the mother dimly that in anguish and care and love, each time the fruit of sin ripened into sorrow, it had been granted to her earth-bound wilful soul to catch a reflection of the heavenly light. All hail, Mary, rich in mercy! Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb, Jesus, who gave his sweat and blood for our sake. While she said over the 5 Aves in memory of the redemption's mysteries of pain, she felt it was through her sorrows only that she dared seek shelter under the cloak of God's mother. Her sorrow for the children she had lost, her heavier sorrows for each stroke of fate that fell upon her sons and that she could not ward from them. Mary, the perfect in purity, in meekness, in obedience to the Father's will, had sorrowed the most of all mothers, and her mercy would see and understand the pale and weak reflection from a sinful woman's heart that had burned with hot and ravaging fleshly love, and with all the sins that fleshly love brings with it, untowardness and defiance, a stony, unforgiving spirit, stubbornness and pride, yet was a mother's heart in despite of everything. Kristin hid her face in her hands. For a moment it seemed to her more than she could bear that she was parted now from them all, from all her sons. Then she said over the last paternoster, She thought of her parting from her father on this spot all those long years ago, of her parting from gout but 2 days back. In childlike thoughtlessness her sons had offended against her, yet she knew that even had they offended against her as she had offended against her father, wilfully and in sin, it could never have changed her heart toward them. It was so easy to forgive one's children. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritus Sancto. She said the words and kissed the cross her father had given her, humbly thankful to feel that, in spite of all, in spite of her ungoverned spirit, yet had it been granted to her restless heart to catch a faint gleam of the love she had seen mirrored in her father's soul, clear and still, even as the brightness of the sky was thrown back now by the great still moorland tarn. Next day the weather was so grey and windy and cold, with mist and rainstorms, that Kristin thought she scarce dared go on with the sick child and brother Torgils. But the monk himself was the most eager. She saw he was fearful he might die before he came to Nidaros. So they took their way across the upland, but the fog was so thick at times that Kristin dared not venture down over the headlong tracks, with cliffs both above and below that she remembered led down to the pilgrim's shelter in Drivdal. So they built a fire when they were come to the top of the glen and rested there for the night. After evening prayer, Brother Arngrim told them a goodly saga of a ship in peril on the sea that was saved by an abbess's prayer to Mary Virgin. The morning star came out over the sea at her command. The monk seemed to have taken a liking to Kristin. While she sat by the blaze, lulling and hushing the child that the others might get to sleep, he edged close to her and began to tell about himself in a whisper. He was a poor fisher's son, and when he was 14 years old, he lost his father and brother at sea one winter night, but was saved himself by another boat. He had thought this a sign and a token, and besides he had grown afraid of the sea, and thus the thought came to him that he should turn monk. But for 3 years more he had had to stay at home with his mother, and they toiled and starved, and he was ever afraid when in a boat. But then his sister was wed, and her husband took over the house and share in the boat, and he took himself to the Minorites of Tunsberg. There they had mocked him at first for his low birth, but the guardian was kind and stood his friend. And, since Brother Torgils Olafsson was come into the brotherhood, all the monks had grown much more pious and peaceable, for he was passing pious and meek, though he was the best born of them all, of a rich yeoman kindred away in Slagen. And his mother and sisters were most bounteous to the cloister. But since they were come to Skidan, and since Brother Torgils was fallen sick, all things were grown much harder again. Brother Arngrim gave Kristin to understand that he marvelled Christ and Mary would make the paths so stony for their poor brethren's feet. "They chose poverty themselves while they lived on earth," said Kristin. "'Tis easy for you to say such things, rich woman as you doubtless are," said the monk angrily. "I warrant you have never proved what it is to go fasting." And Kristin must even agree that so it was. When they were come down among the tilled lands and fared through Uppdal and Soknedal, Brother Torgils got now a ride and now a drive for stretches of the way. But he grew weaker and weaker, and Kristin's company was ever changing, for folk parted from them and went forward, and new pilgrims came up with them. When they came to Stauren, none of them who had crossed the mountains with her were left in her company, saving the 2 monks. And in the morning Brother Arngrim came to her weeping, and said that Brother Torgils had had a sore blood-spitting in the night, and he could go no farther. Now they would come to Nidaros too late, and would miss the festival. Kristin thanked the brothers for their company, and for goodly guidance and help on the journey. Brother Arngrim seemed to be astonished at the richness of her farewell gifts, for his face lighted up. "Ah, she must have a gift in return from him," he said. He drew forth from his wallet a case with some letters in it. On them was written a goodly prayer with all God's names at the end thereof, and an open place was left in the scroll wherein to print the name of the supplicant. Kristin told herself that it was unlikely the monk should know anything of her, with whom she had been wed, or her husband's fate, even if she gave her father's name. Yet she asked him to write only, "Kristin, widow." Down through Galdal she took the paths on the outskirts of the parishes, for she thought that if she met folk from the great manors, it might well happen that one or another would know the sometime mistress of Huseby again, and she was reluctant to be known, though she scarce knew why. The next day she climbed by the forest tracks up over the ridge to the little church on Vartsfjeld that was sacred to John the Baptist, but the folk thereabout called it St. Edmund's. The chapel stood in an opening in the thick woods. It and the knoll behind were mirrored in a pond that fed the healing spring. A wooden cross stood by the beck, and round about lay crutches and staves, and on the bushes nearby hung tatters from old bandages. About the church was a little fenced-in plot, but the gate was fast shut. Kristin kneeled down outside and thought of the time she had sat there with gout on her lap. Then she was clad in silks, one of the company of bravely clad great folks, men and women, from the countryside all around. Sira Eilif stood close by, holding Nakvi and Bjorgul firmly. In the throng outside were her serving maids and henchmen. Then had it been the burden of her burning prayer, that if this poor unhappy child could but be made whole in body and in wits, she would crave nothing more, not even to be freed herself of the sore hurt in her back that had plagued her ever since the twins were born. She thought of Gout, sitting on his iron grey horse, a brave and goodly horseman. And she herself, not many women of her age, nigh to 100 years, were blessed with such health. She had noticed it on her journey across the mountains. "Lord, give me but this, and this, and this. Then I will thank thee, and crave nothing more than this, and this, and this." Never, it seemed to her, had she prayed to God for anything else other than he might grant her her own will. And she had got every time what she had wished for, mostly. And now she sat here with a bruised spirit, not because she had sinned against God, but because she was unhappy that it had been granted her to follow the devices of her own heart to the journey's end. She had not come to God with her garland, nor with her sins and her sorrows, not so long as the world still held a drop of sweetness to mix in her cup. But she came now. Now she had learned that the world is like a tavern, where he who has nothing more to spend is cast out at the door. She felt no joy in her resolve, but it seemed to Kristin that it was not she herself who had resolved. The poor beggars who came into her house had come to bid her go forth. Another will than her own had set her in the company of the poor and sick, and bidden her go with them, away from the home where she had been the mistress, and had ruled as the mother of men. And if now she obeyed the call without too ill a grace, she knew it was because she saw that Gout would thrive the better when she was gone from the manor. She had bent fate to her will. She had had the lot of her own choice. But her sons she could not fashion after her will. They were as God had fashioned them, and their natures drove them on. In striving with them she must be worsted. Gout was a good farmer, a good husband and faithful father, a doughty man and as honourable as most folk. But the stuff for a chieftain he was not, nor was he of a mood to long for what she had coveted for him. But he loved her enough to be troubled when he knew she looked for more from him than he could give. Therefore was she now minded to beg for harbour and sanctuary, though it was bitter to her pride to come in such utter poverty that she could bring no offerings in her hands. But she knew that she was called to come. The fir woods on the knoll stood drinking in the sunlight that sifted through them and sighing so gently. The little church lay there shut and silent, breathing forth a smell of tar. Yearningly, Kristin thought of the dead monk who had taken her hand and led her into the radiance of God's enfolding love when she was an innocent child, had put forth a hand time after time to lead her home from the paths of transgression, both while he lived on earth and since. And of a sudden she remembered as clear as day what she had dreamed of him that night upon the fell. She had dreamed that she stood in the sunshine in the courtyard of some great manor, and Brother Edvin came towards her from the hall house door. His hands were full of bread, and when he came to her he broke off a great piece and gave it to her. She understood that she had to do as she had thought, beg for alms when she came down into the parishes. But in some way or other she had joined company with Brother Edvin, and they too were faring on together, begging. But at the same time she knew that the dream had a twofold meaning. The manor was not only a great manor, but it seemed to her to betoken a holy place, and Brother Edvin was one of the household there. And the bread which he brought and gave to her was not the simple bannock it looked like. It betokened the host, panis angelorum, and she took the bread of the angels at his hands. And now she gave her promise to Brother Edvin's keeping.